What kind of stranger can sit in front of a dusty old piano and play a melody no one has heard in nearly 20 years? Why would a successful woman suddenly freeze after hiring nothing more than a quiet single father to repair a forgotten instrument? And what secret could be hidden inside a song that was never meant to be finished? Charlotte Hayes believed she was simply preparing her late mother's old house for sale. The piano was just another antique to restore before the buyers arrived. But the man she hired didn't begin by fixing broken strings or polishing faded wood. Instead, his fingers found a melody that only one person should have known, a song her mother had written in the final days of her life. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from and what time it is where you are. And if heartfelt stories about family, healing, and second chances mean something to you, don't forget to subscribe and join us for this unforgettable journey. The moving truck had barely disappeared around the corner when Charlotte Hayes unlocked the front door of her childhood home for what she hoped would be one last time. The old Victorian house stood quietly beneath towering live oaks, draped with Spanish moss, as if it had been patiently waiting for someone to decide its future. Dust floated through narrow beams of afternoon sunlight, and every room carried echoes of memories Charlotte had spent years trying to leave behind. She wasn't there to remember. She was there to sell. Every room had already been catalogued by the estate company. The antique furniture would be auctioned. The paintings would go to a collector in Charleston. Even the crystal chandelier had a buyer waiting. Only one item remained: the Steinway grand piano. It occupied the center of the music room, exactly as it had for decades. Its black finish faded by time, its ivory keys yellowed with age. A thin layer of dust covered the lid like untouched snow. Charlotte stopped in the doorway for only a second before forcing herself to keep walking. "Just make it look presentable," she whispered to herself. A gentle knock interrupted the silence. She opened the door to find a man carrying a worn leather toolbox in one hand and a small canvas bag over his shoulder. "I'm Daniel Mercer," he said with an easy smile. "You called about the piano." Charlotte nodded politely. "You work alone?" "I usually do." She noticed the old pickup truck parked by the curb. A young boy, maybe 11 years old, sat inside, reading a paperback novel while absent-mindedly tapping rhythms against the dashboard. "My son's waiting for me," Daniel explained after following her gaze. "School's out for the summer." Charlotte simply nodded again. She wasn't interested in conversations. She led him through the quiet hallway until they reached the music room. "There it is," she said. Daniel stopped speaking the moment he saw the piano. Instead of walking directly toward it, he slowly circled the instrument as though greeting an old friend. His fingertips hovered above the polished wood but didn't touch it immediately. "Beautiful craftsmanship," he murmured. "It hasn't been played in almost 20 years. Charlotte replied. "That's a shame. I only need it looking good enough for buyers." Daniel looked at her for a long moment before answering. "Sometimes people think an old piano is just furniture." His voice remained calm. "But every piano remembers the hands that loved it." Charlotte crossed her arms. "I didn't hire a philosopher." A faint smile appeared on Daniel's face. "No, ma'am. I hired someone to fix it." Without another word, he carefully lifted the piano lid. The familiar scent of aged wood and felt drifted into the room. He adjusted the music stand, examined the strings, tested several tuning pins, then gently pressed one cracked ivory key. Its lonely note echoed through the empty house. From outside came the sound of Noah laughing softly at something inside his book. But inside the room, neither adult moved. Daniel suddenly frowned. Something wasn't right. Kneeling beside the keyboard, He reached beneath the worn wooden frame, where decades of dust had settled unnoticed. His fingers brushed against folded paper, hidden deep inside the instrument. Slowly, very slowly, he pulled out a yellowed sheet of handwritten music. The faded ink had nearly disappeared, but one elegant signature at the bottom froze him where he knelt. Daniel stared at the signature for several long seconds before carefully folding the fragile page exactly as he had found it. He slipped it back into the piano. Not because he wanted to hide it, because he wasn't ready to believe what he had just seen. "Is something wrong?" Charlotte's voice pulled him back to the present. He looked up with a gentle smile. "Nothing serious, just a few surprises inside." She sighed. "This house is full of those." For the rest of the afternoon, the room echoed with quiet sounds instead of conversation. Daniel loosened rusted strings, adjusted worn hammers, and cleaned decades of dust from the soundboard. Every careful movement seemed more like restoring a memory than repairing an instrument. Charlotte watched from the doorway while sorting old family documents into cardboard boxes. Neither of them noticed Noah quietly step inside. He wandered around the room until he stopped beside the piano. "Can I touch it?" he asked. Charlotte hesitated. "It hasn't been played in years." Daniel smiled. "One key won't hurt." Noah gently pressed a single ivory key. Its soft note drifted through the room. "It still sounds lonely," the boy whispered. Charlotte looked away before either of them could see the tears forming in her eyes. "My mother used to say every piano had its own heartbeat," she said quietly. Daniel paused. "She was right." Charlotte frowned. "You sound very certain." "I've restored enough instruments to know." It wasn't a lie, just not the whole truth. The afternoon stretched into evening. As sunlight faded beyond the tall windows, Daniel carefully removed the action mechanism to inspect the interior more thoroughly. Years of neglect had hidden tiny treasures inside. A dried magnolia blossom, an old pencil, a rusted paper clip. Then his flashlight caught something tucked beneath the piano bench. A small cassette tape. Its clear plastic case had yellowed with age. Daniel picked it up carefully. Across the faded label, written in elegant blue ink, were only 3 words. "For Charlotte." His heart tightened. He remembered seeing that handwriting before. Many years ago, in another room, beside another piano. "No, nah," he whispered almost silently. "What is it?" Charlotte asked. Daniel turned the cassette over in his hands before walking toward her. "I think this belongs to you." She stared at the tape without taking it. "I've never seen that before." It was hidden under the bench. Charlotte finally reached for it. Her fingers trembled as she brushed away years of dust. "I don't even own a cassette player anymore." Neither of them spoke. Outside, thunder rolled softly across the Georgia sky. Noah looked from Daniel to Charlotte. "It must be important," he said. Charlotte forced a small smile. "Maybe," but her eyes never left the faded handwriting. Daniel wanted to tell her everything. He wanted to explain why his hands were shaking, why that handwriting felt painfully familiar, why the unfinished page hidden inside the piano had awakened memories he had buried almost 20 years ago. Instead, he swallowed every word. Some truths needed more than the right moment. They needed the right heart. As Daniel packed away his tools for the evening, he glanced once more beneath the keyboard. The folded sheet music remained hidden exactly where he had placed it. Only now he noticed something he had missed before. The composition ended abruptly. Not because it was unfinished, because the final page had been carefully torn away. Daniel barely slept that night. The folded sheet music and the cassette tape stayed in his thoughts long after he tucked Noah into bed. Every time he closed his eyes, another memory surfaced, one he had spent years convincing himself belonged to another lifetime. 20 years earlier, he had been a struggling music student repairing old pianos to pay his tuition. Concert halls had been distant dreams back then, replaced by cramped workshops and long evenings covered in sawdust and varnish. One rainy afternoon, an older woman had walked into the restoration shop, carrying a worn leather folder against her chest. "I heard you're the only one in Savannah patient enough to bring old pianos back to life," she had said with a warm smile. Her name had been Evelyn Hayes. She wasn't wealthy. She wasn't famous. She simply loved music with every part of her soul. She had explained that her family's Steinway no longer held its tuning. The doctors had recently given her difficult news, but she spoke about the illness as though it belonged to someone else. "The piano still has years left," she had said softly. "I only wish I did." Daniel had restored dozens of instruments since then. Yet he had never forgotten those words. Back in the present, morning sunlight spilled across the music room as Daniel removed another section of the piano's action assembly. Charlotte entered carrying 2 mugs of coffee. "I wasn't sure how you take it," she admitted. "Black is perfect." She handed him the cup before looking around the room. "It already sounds different." "It isn't finished." "Neither was my mother." The words escaped her before she could stop them. Silence settled between them. After several moments, Charlotte quietly continued. "She always started writing music, but rarely said she was done. She claimed every melody could grow into something better." Daniel lowered his eyes to the keyboard. "Some melodies only need someone willing to listen." Charlotte studied him carefully. "You talk about music like you've known it your whole life." "I suppose I have." "Well, what made you become a piano restorer instead of a performer?" The question caught him off guard. For a brief moment, he almost answered honestly. Instead, he smiled without happiness. "Life makes different choices for us sometimes." Charlotte accepted the answer, though it clearly wasn't enough. While she returned to organizing old books, Daniel unfolded the hidden sheet music once more. This time he studied every note. His heartbeat quickened. The opening measures matched a melody he remembered hearing Evelyn quietly hum while waiting for him to finish repairing the piano. Decades ago. He could almost hear her gentle voice again. "If I never finish writing it." She had paused, smiling toward the window. Perhaps someone kinder than me will." Daniel closed his eyes. No, that wasn't possible. His fingers instinctively played the first few measures on the newly repaired keyboard. The melody floated through the empty house like a forgotten prayer. Charlotte froze in the hallway. She had heard those notes before. Not on a recording. Not at a concert. Her mother used to hum that exact melody while cooking Sunday breakfast. She slowly turned toward the music room, confusion spreading across her face. "Daniel." He immediately lifted his hands from the keys. Too late. She had heard enough. Enough to know that a complete stranger should never have known the song her mother had taken to the grave. Charlotte stood motionless in the hallway. The final note lingered in the air long after Daniel had lifted his hands from the keyboard. Neither of them spoke. Finally, she stepped into the music room. "Where did you learn that melody?" Daniel slowly closed the piano lid. "I've heard it before." "That's impossible." Her voice remained calm, but her eyes had hardened. My mother never published that song. I know. Charlotte frowned. Then how could you possibly know it? Daniel searched for the right words, but found none. I can't answer that today. The sentence landed between them like a stone. Charlotte folded her arms. You can't, or you won't. Daniel lowered his eyes. I made a promise a long time ago. A promise to who? He remained silent. Charlotte let out a slow breath and shook her head. I hired you to restore a piano, not to bring mysteries into my house. Daniel quietly returned to his work. The conversation ended there, but the silence that followed was far heavier than any argument. Outside, Noah sat on the wide front porch, sketching the old house in a notebook. Every few minutes he looked through the window toward his father before returning to his drawing. Charlotte noticed him. He has your patience. Daniel smiled faintly. He got that from his mother. Charlotte hesitated. I'm sorry. So am I. It was the first completely honest exchange they had shared. Late that afternoon, Charlotte's phone rang. She answered in the front hallway. Hello. Her real estate agent sounded unusually cheerful. Charlotte, we received another offer. She closed her eyes. So soon? It's the highest one yet. How much? The number made her heart skip. It was more than enough to settle every remaining debt connected to her mother's estate. We'll need your signature tomorrow morning if you want to accept. Charlotte stared through the hallway toward the music room. Daniel was carefully polishing the piano's wooden rim, treating every inch as though it mattered. I'll think about it, she replied. You've been thinking for months, the agent answered gently. This house deserves someone who'll actually live in it. After ending the call, Charlotte walked outside for fresh air. Noah looked up from his notebook. Miss Hayes. Yeah. Can I ask you something? She smiled politely. Of course. Why does everyone keep talking about selling this house? She looked toward the enormous oak tree shading the front yard. Because no one lives here anymore. He thought about that answer. My dad says houses get lonely. Charlotte laughed softly despite herself. Did he really? He says people leave fingerprints on walls without ever touching them. She looked back through the window. Daniel was adjusting the cracked wooden metronome he had found among the piano's accessories. To her surprise, it suddenly began ticking. Tick, tick, tick. The steady rhythm filled the quiet room. For a brief second, the house no longer felt abandoned. It felt awake. Charlotte swallowed hard. She turned away before the feeling could change her mind. Inside, Daniel carefully reached into his toolbox. His fingers brushed against the folded sheet music once more. He looked toward the hallway where Charlotte had disappeared. This was the moment. He could finally tell her everything. He took one step toward the door, then stopped. The promise he had carried for nearly 20 years still weighed more than the truth. The next morning arrived with a heavy gray sky hanging over Savannah. Charlotte stood alone in the kitchen, staring at the purchase agreement lying on the counter. A silver pen rested beside it, waiting for a signature that should have been easy. Instead, she found herself listening. Somewhere down the hallway, Daniel was tuning the Steinway one careful note at a time. The soft sounds drifted through the old house like quiet footsteps. She folded the contract and walked toward the music room. Daniel looked up as she entered. I've decided to accept the offer, she said. His hands froze above the keyboard. I see. The buyers are coming tomorrow. He nodded once. Then I'll make sure the piano is ready. Charlotte waited for him to say something else. to ask her not to sell, to explain why he looked at the piano as if it belonged to someone he loved. Instead, he simply returned to tightening another tuning pin. The silence frustrated her more than any argument could have. "Why won't you tell me the truth?" Daniel carefully placed the tuning hammer on the bench. "Because it isn't only my story." She stepped closer. "It became my story the moment you played my mother's melody." He looked away. "I know. No, I don't think you do." Her voice cracked for the first time. "For 20 years I've believed that song disappeared with her. Then you walk into my house, touch a few keys, and suddenly it's alive again." She pointed toward the piano. "Tell me how—" Daniel closed his eyes. "I can't." "You can't." She shook her head. "Chair, or you're choosing not to." "I'm trying to keep a promise. To someone who's gone." "Yes." Charlotte laughed bitterly. "And what about the daughter she left behind?" The question struck harder than she intended. Daniel lowered his head. He had asked himself that same question hundreds of times. No answer had ever felt right. At that moment, Noah appeared quietly in the doorway, carrying 2 paper bags from a nearby bakery. "I brought lunch," he announced with a cheerful smile. The tension in the room stopped him immediately. "Did I come at a bad time?" Daniel forced a smile. "No, buddy." Noah placed the bags on a nearby table. As he turned, he accidentally brushed against the piano bench. The old cassette tape slipped onto the wooden floor. Charlotte immediately picked it up. She stared at the faded handwriting again, then slowly looked back at Daniel. "You've seen this writing before." He didn't answer. "You recognized it the first day?" "Still nothing." "So you've been lying to me?" "No." His voice was calm but tired. "I've been carrying something I never believed belonged to me." Charlotte's eyes filled with disappointment. "I trusted you, and I never wanted to break that." "But you already have—" She carefully placed the cassette into her coat pocket. "When you finish restoring the piano, your work here is done." Daniel didn't argue. Perhaps he deserved that. Charlotte turned toward the hallway before stopping at the doorway. Without looking back, she spoke quietly. "I don't know what promise you're protecting." She paused. "But keeping it may cost you the chance to keep another one." The front door closed behind her. The entire house seemed to fall silent once again. Daniel remained seated before the piano. His fingers rested lightly on the worn ivory keys. For the first time in nearly 20 years. He wondered whether protecting Evelyn's final wish had become an excuse for hiding from his own fear. Daniel did not return to the Hayes house the next morning. He couldn't. Instead, he drove Noah to the small community school where he volunteered every Friday, then parked beside the Savannah River without turning off the engine. The unopened toolbox sat on the passenger seat. For the first time in years, he questioned whether silence had become less about honoring a promise and more about protecting himself from another goodbye. His phone vibrated. Charlotte's name appeared on the screen. He stared at it until the call ended. A moment later, another message arrived. "The buyers are coming at 3. If there's anything you should have told me, today is your last chance." Daniel closed his eyes. 20 years of memories pressed against him all at once. Meanwhile, Charlotte stood alone inside the music room. The house felt strangely empty without the quiet rhythm of tuning hammers and careful footsteps. She reached into her coat pocket and removed the cassette tape. The faded label still read, "For Charlotte." After several phone calls, She finally found an old electronics repair shop willing to lend her a cassette player. An hour later, she carried the small machine into the music room and carefully inserted the tape. The reels began to turn. Static filled the room. Then, a familiar voice. Soft, gentle, older than Charlotte remembered. My sweet girl. Charlotte stopped breathing. It was her mother. If you're hearing this, then Daniel finally decided you were ready. Tears instantly blurred Charlotte's vision. I asked him to keep this recording until the day he believed listening would heal you instead of breaking you. A long pause followed. Charlotte could hear her mother taking a slow, careful breath. The doctors told me I wouldn't finish the song. A quiet laugh escaped through the recording. I argued with them. They usually won. Charlotte covered her mouth. I left the final page with Daniel. Her heart pounded. I told him not to finish it because I wanted a perfect ending. Another pause. I wanted him to finish it only after he understood something I didn't. Charlotte listened through tears. Music isn't about perfect endings. It's about giving someone else the courage to continue. The recording crackled softly. If Daniel is sitting beside you, well, please forgive him. He made me one promise, that he would protect this song until the day it belonged to you. He wanted to refuse, but I insisted. Charlotte slowly lowered her head. Every angry word she had spoken the previous day echoed painfully inside her. The tape continued. And Daniel. Evelyn's voice softened even more. If you're hearing this too, you've hidden from your own music long enough. You repair broken pianos because you still believe you're the broken one. My dear boy, you never were. The recording ended with a gentle click. Silence filled the room. Charlotte remained motionless, tears falling freely onto her hands. A few minutes later, the front door opened quietly. Daniel stepped inside. Neither of them spoke. Charlotte walked toward him, holding the cassette with trembling fingers. I know now. Daniel's voice was barely above a whisper. I'm sorry. She slowly shook her head. No. She placed the cassette into his hands. You kept your promise. Daniel looked down at the faded label. I don't know if I can finish her song. Charlotte's eyes met his. You still think you're protecting her. She took one slow step closer. But maybe. She's been trying to protect you all along. Daniel looked toward the silent Steinway. His fingers trembled. For the first time in 20 years. He wasn't afraid of the piano. He was afraid of what finishing the song would finally force him to believe about himself. The piano remained silent for the rest of the afternoon. Daniel sat alone on the worn wooden bench, while sunlight stretched across the polished lid in long golden lines. The folded sheet music rested beside him, untouched. For 20 years, he had protected Evelyn's final wish. Now, protecting it was no longer enough. Charlotte quietly closed the music room door behind her, leaving him alone. She understood something her mother had known long before she did. Some battles could not be won by comforting words. They had to be surrendered from within. Outside, Noah kicked a soccer ball across the front yard until it rolled against the porch steps. He picked it up and noticed his father staring through the window at the silent piano. Without saying anything, the boy walked inside. Dad! Daniel looked up. Yeah, buddy. Were you ever scared to play? Daniel gave a tired smile. More times than I can count. Noah sat beside him on the piano bench. I thought grown-ups stopped being scared. Daniel laughed softly. I wish that were true. The room grew quiet again. Finally, Noah looked down at the yellowed sheet music. Is that the song? Daniel nodded. The one Grandma Evelyn asked you to finish. Another nod. Noah hesitated before speaking again. Then why haven't you? Daniel's fingers tightened around the edge of the bench. Because I was afraid I'd ruin it. The boy thought for a moment. When Mom taught me to ride my bike, I crashed into Mrs. Taylor's mailbox. Daniel chuckled despite himself. I remember. I wanted to quit. So did I. But Mom told me something. Noah smiled as if hearing her voice again. The falling isn't what ends the ride. Staying on the ground does. Daniel felt his throat tighten. Those words belonged to his late wife. She had spoken them only weeks before the illness took her away. He had spent years remembering her smile, but somehow forgotten her courage. Noah gently pushed the folded sheet music toward him. I think she'd tell you to play. Daniel closed his eyes. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to imagine his wife and Evelyn sitting together somewhere beyond memory, patiently waiting for him to stop carrying guilt that neither of them had ever asked him to bear. Slowly, he unfolded the fragile pages. The melody ended exactly where he remembered. Then he opened a small envelope that Charlotte had quietly left beside the music. Inside was the missing final page. She had found it tucked inside her mother's old recipe book only an hour earlier. Across the top, in Evelyn's graceful handwriting, were 6 simple words. Finish this only with hope. Daniel smiled through tears. The final measures weren't complete. Only a handful of notes appeared before empty staff lines stretched across the page. Evelyn had never wanted someone to copy her ending. She wanted someone to discover their own. Daniel placed every page onto the music stand. His hands hovered above the ivory keys. They trembled. Not from fear of making a mistake, but from finally believing he had permission to begin again. Outside, the evening sun dipped below the ancient oak trees. Its warm light spilled across the room like a quiet blessing. Charlotte stood silently in the hallway. Noah waited near the doorway. Neither of them spoke. Then, Daniel lowered his hands. The first note rang through the house, clear and warm. A second followed. Then a third. The unfinished melody had finally begun breathing again. The first note floated through the old house, with a warmth that neither time nor silence had managed to erase. Daniel closed his eyes. He wasn't performing. He wasn't trying to impress anyone. He was simply following the path Evelyn had begun so many years ago. Each measure unfolded naturally, as though the piano itself had been waiting to tell the rest of the story. Charlotte stood just outside the music room, one hand resting against the doorway. She had expected beautiful music. She had not expected memories. The melody carried her back to Sunday mornings, when sunlight poured across the kitchen floor. Her mother would hum softly while baking cinnamon bread, stopping every so often to kiss the top of Charlotte's head before returning to the stove. Charlotte could almost smell the warm cinnamon again. She remembered sitting beneath the piano as a little girl while Evelyn practiced late into the evening. Back then, Charlotte believed every mother knew how to turn ordinary days into music. She hadn't realized how rare that gift truly was. Daniel continued playing. The unfinished measures slowly gave way to new ones. They weren't louder. They weren't more complicated. They simply felt complete. His left hand repeated the gentle rhythm Evelyn had written decades earlier. His right hand answered it with a melody filled not with sorrow, but with quiet hope. Tears rolled down Charlotte's cheeks before she realized she was crying. Then something unexpected happened. Without thinking, she whispered the words her mother used to sing. "When the morning finds your heart." Her voice trembled. "Don't be afraid to begin." Daniel looked up in surprise but never stopped playing. Charlotte took another slow breath. The next line came back as though it had been hiding inside her all these years. "Every ending leaves." She smiled through tears. Well, a door still open. Daniel felt chills run through him. Those lyrics had never appeared on Evelyn's handwritten pages. She had carried them only in her voice. Somehow, mother and daughter were finishing the song together. Noah quietly slipped into the room and sat cross-legged on the floor. He didn't fully understand what was happening. He only knew that no one should interrupt moments like this. As the final chorus approached, Daniel hesitated for only an instant. Then he played the closing passage he had carried in his heart for 20 years. Not as Evelyn, not as the young man who once repaired her piano, but as the person her kindness had helped him become. The final chord lingered softly beneath the high ceiling. No one moved. Even the old cracked metronome seemed to pause between its steady ticks. Charlotte slowly walked toward the piano. She placed her fingertips on the polished wood exactly where her mother used to rest her hand after every practice. "I've spent 20 years believing she never finished saying goodbye," she whispered. Daniel looked at her quietly. "She didn't—" Charlotte turned toward him. "She was waiting for someone to help me hear the rest." For several moments, neither of them spoke. Then Charlotte reached into the folder containing the purchase agreement. Without taking her eyes off the piano, she slowly removed the signed contract. She looked at the pages. She looked around the music room. Finally, she tore the contract cleanly in half. Then again, and again. The torn pieces drifted gently onto the hardwood floor. Outside, the real estate agent's car pulled into the driveway. Charlotte heard the engine stop. She took one deep breath. This time, she wasn't preparing to say goodbye. She was finally ready to decide what this house was meant to become. The front door opened before anyone had a chance to speak. A well-dressed couple stepped inside, followed by Charlotte's real estate agent carrying a leather portfolio and a welcoming smile. "Good afternoon," the agent called. "I hope we're not interrupting." Charlotte looked down at the torn pieces of the purchase agreement scattered across the hardwood floor. "No," she answered calmly. "You arrived at exactly the right moment." The agent noticed the shredded contract. His smile slowly disappeared. "I'm afraid I don't understand." Charlotte bent down and gathered the torn pages into her hands. "I've changed my mind." The couple exchanged confused glances. But we have a signed offer," the agent said, carefully. "You had one." Charlotte smiled with surprising peace. "Now you have an apology." The buyers looked disappointed, but not angry. The older woman stepped closer to the piano and gently touched its polished edge. "I wondered why this house felt different the moment we walked in," she said quietly. "It doesn't feel empty." Charlotte glanced toward Daniel. "For the first time in a long while." "It isn't." The couple thanked her for her honesty before quietly leaving with the agent. As the front door closed again, silence returned to the old house. This time, it felt comforting instead of lonely. Charlotte turned toward Daniel. "I owe you something." He shook his head. No. Yes. She walked to the piano and rested her hand on the lid. My whole life, I thought this house was full of memories that kept me trapped. She smiled softly. I never realized they were waiting to set me free. Daniel looked around the room. The music did that. You did. He lowered his eyes. I only finished what your mother started. Charlotte gently shook her head. You finished what fear interrupted. Daniel didn't answer. For years he had believed the greatest gift he could give Evelyn was silence. Now he understood that the greater gift had been trust. Trust that Charlotte would be strong enough to hear the truth. Trust that he could stop carrying guilt that had never belonged to him. A familiar voice interrupted the quiet. Dad! Noah stood in the doorway holding his sketchbook. I finished my drawing. He carried it across the room and handed it to Charlotte. The picture showed the old Victorian house beneath the giant oak tree. Through one glowing window, 3 figures sat around the piano. Above them, music drifted into the evening sky like tiny birds. Charlotte stared at the drawing for a long moment. It's beautiful. Noah smiled shyly. I didn't draw a house. She looked at him with curiosity. No. I drew people finding each other. Charlotte felt tears gathering once again. She carefully knelt beside him. Would you help me with something? He nodded. I don't want this place to become another private museum. She looked toward Daniel. I want children to hear music here again. Daniel's eyes widened. Charlotte continued. Free lessons. Community concerts. A place where no one feels they have to earn the right to belong. Daniel remained speechless. She smiled. My mother believed every unfinished song deserved another chance. Then she looked directly at him. I think people do too. Outside, neighbors who had heard the piano earlier slowly gathered along the sidewalk. One by one, they paused beneath the old oak tree. Some smiled. Some simply listened. None of them knew the entire story. They didn't need to. Sometimes healing announced itself without a single explanation. As the evening breeze carried the last echoes of music through the neighborhood, Daniel looked at the old Steinway one more time. For the first time since Evelyn's final promise. It no longer felt like something he had been guarding. It finally felt like something he could share. 3 months later, the front porch of the old Hayes house looked different. Fresh flower boxes lined the windows. Children's bicycles rested beneath the giant oak tree. Soft laughter drifted through the open windows almost every afternoon. The weathered brass plaque beside the front door no longer displayed the Hayes family name alone. Instead, it read, The Evelyn Hayes Community Music House. Every song deserves to be finished. Charlotte paused before unlocking the front door that Saturday morning. She smiled as she listened to the sound already filling the house. Music. Not perfect music. Children's music. The kind filled with missed notes, uneven rhythms, nervous laughter, and hopeful beginnings. Exactly the kind her mother would have loved. Inside, Daniel carefully adjusted the height of a piano bench while Noah helped a little girl no older than 7 find middle C. I think that's it, Noah said. The little girl pressed the key. A bright note echoed through the room. Her face lit up. I did it. You sure did, Noah laughed. Daniel watched quietly. Years ago, he would have corrected every mistake. Today, he celebrated every attempt. Charlotte entered, carrying a tray of homemade cinnamon rolls. The familiar scent floated through the room. Daniel smiled. That smells familiar. She laughed softly. My mother's recipe. I had a feeling. Every Saturday had slowly become more than piano lessons. Parents stayed for coffee. Neighbors brought homemade desserts. Retired musicians volunteered. Children who had never touched an instrument before now hurried through the front door every weekend. The old house had found a new heartbeat. Late that morning, after the last lesson ended, the children gathered around the Steinway. Charlotte carefully lifted a framed photograph onto the piano. It showed Evelyn sitting beside the same instrument years before, smiling with quiet joy. Beside the photograph rested 3 simple objects: the cracked wooden metronome, the brass tuning hammer, and the faded handwritten sheet music. Daniel looked at them for a long moment. They belong here. Charlotte nodded. So people remember. He gently touched the edge of the frame. For years I thought I was protecting her memory. Charlotte smiled. You were... She looked around the room, where children chased one another between rows of folding chairs. But memories aren't meant to stay locked away. They're meant to keep growing. Daniel glanced toward Noah, who was patiently helping another student close the piano lid correctly. His son caught his eye and smiled. Daniel smiled back. Without realizing it, he had finally become the example his wife had always believed he could be. Not on a concert stage, not under bright lights, but here, exactly where people needed him. That afternoon, before everyone left, Charlotte walked to the piano. I have one last surprise. She opened a small wooden box. Inside lay the original cassette tape. Beside it rested a newly digitized recording. We restored Mother's voice. Daniel looked at her in surprise. So every child who learns here can hear the woman who started all of this. Charlotte pressed a small speaker. Static filled the room for only a moment. Then Evelyn's gentle voice returned. If you're listening, Heartwarming. Thank you for letting music bring you together. The room became perfectly still. Some of the children looked at one another without fully understanding. The adults understood enough for everyone. When the recording ended, no one applauded. Instead, one little boy quietly sat down at the piano. He carefully played the first 3 notes of Evelyn's melody. Another child joined him. Then another. Soon the room was filled with hesitant hands, imperfect notes, and joyful laughter. Daniel looked toward the sunlight pouring through the old windows. For the first time in many years, he no longer heard an unfinished song. He heard dozens of new ones just beginning. Sometimes the greatest gift we can leave behind isn't money, success, or even a beautiful home. Sometimes it's the courage to help someone else keep going when we no longer can. Evelyn's song was never really about music. It was about hope finding its way from one heart to another, even across generations. Now we'd love to hear from you. Have you ever kept a promise to someone you loved, even after they were gone? Or has someone ever left you a memory that changed the direction of your life? Share your story in the comments. We read them, and your words may encourage someone else who needs hope today. If this story touched your heart, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and join us for more unforgettable stories about family, healing, second chances, and the quiet moments that change lives forever. Until next time, take care of the people you love and never underestimate the power of one unfinished song.